He once ruled boardrooms with nothing but his voice, sharp, commanding, untouchable. But now, silence ruled him. Machines breathed in place of lungs. Monitors blinked where applause once echoed. And she, a stranger in powder blue scrubs, chose to stay when no one else did. Amelia Hart moved through the ICU like a whisper, gentle, unnoticed by most, but today her hands moved with deliberate grace. She dipped a soft cloth into warm water and began to gently bathe the chest of a man who hadn't spoken, blinked, or moved in weeks. Darius Cole, once a name that made headlines, now lay still beneath a sea of sterile sheets, his strength reduced to muscle memory. Behind the beeping monitors and fluorescent lights, there was another sound. One only she seemed to notice. The kind of silence where something sacred quietly begins to grow. What Amelia didn't know was that he heard everything, every word, every touch, and when he woke, he would change both their lives forever. Wherever you're watching from, have you ever loved without being seen? Comment below, because what comes next is nothing short of miraculous. Before the crash that silenced him, Darius Cole was the kind of man headlines chased. A self-made tech mogul with a billion-dollar smile and a reputation for being both brilliant and impossible. People admired his vision but whispered about his detachment, how he built empires without ever letting anyone in. Beneath the tailored suits and bold decisions lived a boy once abandoned by his father, betrayed by early partners, and hardened by years of loneliness wrapped in luxury. Wealth became his fortress, success his armor. But the truth was he'd lost himself long before the accident. The coma didn't strip him of his identity. It revealed what was already empty. Across the room from the man the world thought they knew stood Amelia Hart, a 26-year-old nurse fresh out of training but carrying a lifetime of grief. She didn't become a nurse for the paycheck or prestige. She did it because her mother died in a hospital much like this one, hooked to machines, eyes vacant, ignored in her final days. Amelia had been a teenager then, watching helplessly as nurses rushed by, too busy to notice the fear in her mother's eyes. She had vowed quietly that no one else would pass through the silence without being seen. The ICU was a world apart from the rest of the hospital. It was a place where time stretched and shrank unpredictably, where machines hummed like lullabies for the barely living. White walls stared blankly, and overhead lights glared without mercy, never dimming as if rest were forbidden here. This was the backdrop of Darius's stillness, his body strong but unmoving, a titan caught between breaths. Most nurses treated him as a task. Amelia saw something else. She began placing small flowers by his bedside, nothing grand, just splashes of color in a colorless room. She read to him in quiet tones. Poetry, news headlines, even childhood fables. She adjusted his blankets with care, whispered good morning and good night as if he were awake to hear them. And though he didn't stir, something began to change. Not in him, but in her. Where she had once felt like a ghost among rushing staff and faceless patients, now she had a purpose, a connection, even if it was one-sided. She didn't realize it yet, but her presence had begun to soften the sterile edges of that room. Darius, though unresponsive, became her silent companion, someone who held her gaze even in sleep, someone she didn't have to pretend for. Her hands slowed when they touched his arm. Her eyes lingered longer when checking his monitor. and the hollow ache she carried since her mother's passing began to shift. Not disappear, but pulse differently. In the quiet rhythm between their breaths and beeping machines, a bond began to take shape. Wordless, weightless, but undeniably real. It started with a twitch. Barely there, so small it could have been a spasm, a trick of the eye, or just the hope inside Amelia trying to find proof in nothing. She was wiping down Darius's arm when she saw his fingers curl slightly. Her breath caught, her hand hovering midair. She waited, staring. Nothing. Just the steady rhythm of the machines. She mentioned it to the charge nurse during rounds, voice quiet but insistent. "I think he moved." The response came with a sigh and a glance that felt like dismissal. "Wishful thinking," the nurse said. "Reflexes don't mean recovery." Amelia nodded, but something in her wouldn't. Let it go. It wasn't just what she saw, it was what she felt. Like the silence between them had shifted somehow. She began to spend more time at his bedside, reading aloud from her favorite books, talking to him about her life, the way her cat refused to eat unless she played music, how she hated the smell of peppermint, how her father still wrote her letters by hand. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. Her words weren't rehearsed. They weren't clinical. They were the kind of stories you tell when you believe someone might actually be listening. Other nurses began to whisper. She caught the glances, the soft chuckles, the rolled eyes. "She's getting too attached," one muttered. "He's just a body." But Amelia didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that staying present for someone who can't speak back is a kind of rebellion in itself. And quietly, she rebelled. The emotional weight grew heavier with each passing day. She began to dream of him speaking. She imagined his voice, not booming like the CEOs on TV, but soft, grateful, maybe even broken. She woke from those dreams with tears in her eyes and guilt on her chest. Was she projecting? Was she wrong to hope? She wasn't supposed to blur those lines, but the truth was, the lines had never been clear. One night, after a long shift where no one had smiled and 3 patients had coded, she returned to his room with aching feet and a heart that felt hollow. She warmed the water, gathered the cloth, and began the familiar process, bathing him slowly, carefully, like he mattered. Her hands moved across his chest with reverence, not routine. The room was quiet, except for the beeping machines and the occasional gust of wind pressing against the window. She paused, cloth resting on his collarbone, and whispered, "You don't have to come back. Just know someone stayed." A long silence followed, a sacred one. Then, barely noticeable, a tear rolled from the corner of Darius's eye. It traced the side of his temple and disappeared into the pillow. Amelia's hand froze. She blinked, heart racing. She didn't speak, didn't move, afraid to break the moment. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. She simply placed her hand over his and sat beside him in the silence they now shared. The next morning, as the sun filtered through the blinds in fractured gold lines, Darius opened his eyes. Not wide, not sudden, just a slow, steady blink, as if waking not from a coma, but from a life he'd forgotten how to live. The moment Darius's eyes fluttered open, the room transformed. Machines still beeped and tubes still pulsed, but suddenly, the sterile hum of the ICU felt charged with something electric, something alive. His gaze was slow to focus, blinking against the harsh hospital lights, his chest rising with unfamiliar effort. Nurses called for the attending. Voices filled the space. Footsteps thundered in. Doctors swarmed his bedside, checking pupils, calling his name, asking questions. But Darius didn't respond to any of them. His eyes, unblinking now, searched past the crowd until they landed on Amelia, standing in the corner, frozen in disbelief and hope. He didn't speak at first. He just stared at her, like she was the only thing in the room that wasn't new, the only thing that had stayed. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the tests had been run, he whispered through cracked lips, "You were the only one who touched me like I was real." His voice was raspy, but the words carried more weight than anything that had been said all morning. Amelia stepped closer, swallowing the lump in her throat, unsure whether to speak or cry. She did neither. She just nodded, her hand wrapping around his in quiet confirmation. News spread quickly. A millionaire waking from a coma? The media swarmed, like bees to honey. Cameras were requested. Interviews were offered. Executives from Darius's former companies hovered in the hallway, already calculating the headlines. But Darius wanted none of it. He asked for silence, not spotlight. He asked for peace, not praise. And most of all, he asked for her, Amelia. They sat together in the recovery room later that day, alone for the first time since the world had rediscovered his name. The machines still whispered around them, but neither needed to fill the space with words. Eventually, Darius turned to her and said, "I was rich before the crash, but in the dark, I was finally seen." He wasn't looking for sympathy. He wasn't performing grief. He was simply telling the truth. Amelia didn't respond with cliches or soft denials. She didn't try to fix what he felt. She just sat there, still and open, offering the same presence she had in his most vulnerable hours. She didn't need to speak to be heard, and that's what made him trust her. Darius began therapy within days. Not because the hospital insisted, but because he wanted to. The transformation wasn't dramatic. There were no grand declarations or immediate revelations. Instead, it came like the sunrise. Quiet, slow, undeniable. He started with simple stretches, breathing exercises, then journaling. He spoke to specialists, yes, but more often, he asked questions of the nurses, the janitors, the people the world overlooked. He began to listen, not just to his body, but to the lives happening around him. His voice returned gradually, but it carried a different tone now, measured, thoughtful. Where he once filled boardrooms with words, he now chose them carefully, sparingly. Silence no longer frightened him. It grounded him. His presence didn't shout anymore. It lingered gently, like the echo of something meaningful. What once was silence had become intention, and what once had been a man asleep in a bed, ignored by everyone but one, had now become someone utterly changed, not by fame, not by fortune, but by the simple human miracle of being cared for without condition. A week after Darius regained consciousness, a letter arrived in Amelia's staff mailbox. Handwritten, sealed in parchment, no return address. At first, she thought it was a thank you note from a patient's family. But as she unfolded it, the handwriting sent a chill through her. It was his. Inside, a single-page document outlined a clause from Darius's will, written long before. The accident, when he believed he had no one to trust, no one who truly saw him. The clause detailed that, in the event of his death, all of his companies would be dissolved, and his entire estate donated to an anonymous caregiver. Someone who had stayed, not for the name, not for the title, but for the unseen humanity. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she read the final line. I was prepared to disappear, but you gave me a reason to stay. They sat together later that evening in the quiet of his room, just the soft hum of monitors in the background. The light outside had dimmed into soft blues and golds, casting their silhouettes against the walls. Darius looked out the window, his voice barely above a whisper. She died alone, he said. My mother, in a hallway. The hospital was full. She waited for care that never came. No one held her hand. He paused, as if the silence could absorb the weight of what he had carried for decades. That's why I never trusted hospitals, never trusted people who wore smiles like uniforms. But you stayed. The connection between them deepened, not as patient and nurse, or even as survivor and savior, but as two people shaped by invisible grief. Amelia saw it now, how their lives, though different in rhythm, had echoed the same ache. The loss of a mother. The pain of watching someone disappear without being seen. Together, they began to imagine something different. Not a charity, not a vanity project, but a sanctuary, a healing foundation, not named after Darius, but after the very force that had pulled him back. We'll call it the Scene Project, Amelia suggested. Because healing, she said, gently touching his hand, is being seen when no one else looks. He nodded. Let's make it real. A few days later, Amelia found something framed at the foot of Darius's bed. It had been handwritten, once scribbled on a hospital whiteboard when he first arrived unconscious. A quote from a meditation she had whispered to him during a late-night shift, never expecting him to hear. Now, etched in elegant ink, it read, Healing is being seen when no one else looks. It had stayed with him through the silence, and now it would become the heartbeat of their shared legacy. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Heart Center didn't involve confetti or cameras. It was quiet, intentionally so, just a circle of people who had been changed, standing beneath soft light as the hospital's new wing officially opened. The entrance was marked by a sculpture, flame-shaped, forged from surgical steel and candlelight-colored glass. It flickered with a warmth that felt alive, as if glowing with every silent thank you that had ever gone unspoken in hospital rooms like this one. It stood as a symbol not of fire's destruction, but of healing's quiet power. Above the doors, in silver lettering, read, The Heart Center, for those who waited in silence. Amelia walked through those doors not as a nurse but as the newly appointed director. Not because she'd climbed the ranks or pushed for a title, but because Darius had said simply, She understands stillness. And that was enough. She didn't change her uniform. She still tied her hair the same way. But something in her posture had shifted. She walked with the calm presence of someone who had not only witnessed transformation, but had become part of it. Inside, the space breathed differently than the rest of the hospital. The walls were painted in soft blues and muted earth tones. There were art stations for children in trauma, sensory rooms for patients unable to communicate, and alcoves designed, not for efficiency, but for peace. Patients who had once been overlooked were now prioritized. The forgotten had a name here, a presence, a voice. Darius came often, but he no longer wore tailored suits or carried an entourage. He preferred to sit cross-legged on a cushion in the children's corner, reading books aloud with quiet inflection, often pausing between pages to let the silence settle in. He was no longer the man who filled rooms with strategy and speed. He had become something else entirely, someone who had learned to wait, to watch, to hold space. "They used to call me unstoppable," he once said during a donor's tour, standing beneath the flickering sculpture. But the miracle was learning how to pause. Amelia had become a pillar among staff and patients alike. Nurses began adopting her rituals, speaking gently to unconscious patients, adding soft music to rooms, leaving small handwritten notes on pillows. The ICU softened, not just in decor, but in spirit. Protocols were still followed, but hearts began to lead. Some said they could feel the difference as soon as they walked in. Others couldn't explain it. They just knew they didn't feel as alone. Patients began to request Amelia by name, not just for medical reasons, but for comfort, for the calm she carried, for the way her presence felt like proof that someone was listening, even in silence. The Heart Center grew not because of money, but because of meaning. And somewhere deep in its heart was the unshakable truth that healing doesn't always begin with medicine. Sometimes it begins when someone stays, when someone notices, when someone, against all logic, chooses to care even when no one else does. She bathed him when the world forgot him. He rose and gave the world back its humanity. Together, they reminded us, healing begins when someone stays. Not with grand gestures or loud declarations, but in the smallest, quietest moments. A touch, a presence, a whisper in the dark. Amelia and Darius didn't meet through fate or fame, but through silence, where two lonely hearts recognized something sacred. Their story isn't about survival alone. It's about the transformation that happens when someone is seen, not as a case, but as a soul. So now we ask you, have you ever shown love when no one was watching? What did it teach you? If this story reminded you of someone with a healer's heart, someone who shows up when it matters most, share it. Tag them. Let them know their kindness didn't go unnoticed. And if your heart believes in stories that uplift and restore, follow us. Because in a world of noise, we're here to tell the quiet truths that matter. Thank you for believing in quiet miracles. Until next time, stay kind, stay present,